In the federal election last fall, much was made about a new party to the right of the Conservatives. But on Election Day, that new party didn't win a seat, and support came in at just below 5%. Mind you, that's nearly double what the federal Greens got, and they elected 2 MPs. This Ontario election, there is more than one new entrant on the right. Will they make an impact at the polls? And if so, will it be to their benefit, or Doug Ford's detriment, or both? With us to consider that on Manhattan Island in New York City, Sean Speer, editor-at-large of The Hub and a senior fellow at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. In the downtown core of Ontario's capital city, Ginny Roth, progressive conservative strategist currently working on Pierre Poilievre's federal conservative leadership bid. She's national practice lead for government relations at Crestview Strategy. And in Midtown, Martin Regcon, Queen's Park columnist for the Toronto Star. And it's great to welcome you three back to our airwaves. I want to start by quoting something from the National Post from this weekend that I suspect all of you saw. Ford Nation has been subsumed into the progressive Conservatives and moved sharply to the left, poaching in Liberal and NDP territory. It has driven those parties farther left, and the substantial minority of Ontarians, who are in fact moderately conservative, have effectively been invited to stick with the progressive Conservatives as the best they've got. In moving Ontario provincial politics so far to the left, Doug Ford has invited the vacuum on the right to be filled. And Jim and Belinda Karahalios, the former progressive Conservative MPP, expelled for sanity over COVID, have started that process. That's Lord Black of Cross Harbour, Conrad Black, writing that in the National Post, referring, of course, to the New Blue Party, which is one of the right-wing entrants on the Ontario political scene this campaign that the Karahalioses have formed. Ginny, I wonder if you could start us off by telling us whether, in your view, Lord Black's got it right.
Well, there's part of what Lord Black writes about that is compelling to me. I'm quite conservative myself in a sort of both ideological and cultural way. And so, yeah, at the height of COVID, actually, particularly as COVID dragged on, I think there was a sense among ideological conservatives for whom the states reaching into our life, the government reaching into our life and restricting, maybe even beyond what was required by the science, though that was certainly up for debate. There were many of us who sort of went, "Is this really necessary? I thought we had a majority PC government. What's going on?" And so that part speaks to me. However, I think Lord Black is really simplifying in terms of his political analysis of what's going on. There's no question that the opposition parties, namely the NDP and the Liberals in Ontario, have sort of vacated the center of politics, vacated the space that is now being totally dominated by the Doug Ford PCs. But I think the reason he's been able to dominate that is because he's married a sort of centrist economics with a cultural populism that is really compelling to a lot of voters who don't put themselves on an ideological spectrum, who don't crave the kind of right-wing red meat that maybe I crave. And so, yes, I think the PCs are going to win a majority government. You may see some people on specific issue sets who support the New Blue Party because they care about those issues and they don't see the Ford PC speaking on them. But I don't think it speaks to some split on the right, at least not yet.
Martin, I'd like your take on whether or not you agree with Lord Black that because the progressive Conservatives have moved so much into the centre and that the other parties are so far on the left, again, his view, it's vacated the right, and New Blue and, for that matter, Ontario have moved in there.
Well, I think Conrad Black misreads Ontario politics, both with hyperbole, but also hypocrisy. First of all, I'll come to the hypocrisy in a moment. The hyperbole is that, yes, Doug Ford, Freudian slip there. Doug Ford is definitely non-ideological in a conventional sense, as Ginny might see it. He is a populist, and he's all over the map. Center in some issues, centrist, center right in some issues, repositioning himself, shape-shifting, but also right-wing on other issues. No question. Frozen minimum wage initially. He's tax cutting all the time. He's Mr. Tax Fighter, fee rebater. I see Jenny nodding appreciatively. So on the NDP and Liberals have not gone to the left. There's a convergence of sorts to the center. The NDP and the Liberals are also tax fighters now, freezing taxes. Andrea Horwath, $200,000 income. We talked about this last time, Steve. frozen, no extra tax increases. Stephen Del Duca, cutting taxes on your prepared food. They're all singing from the same songbook in a different way, just different lines. Now, hypocrisy. Conrad Black in that same article talks about his dear friend Caroline Mulroney, and I wonder what Caroline Mulroney and Brian Mulroney think of Conrad Black giving a nod of the hat, a tip of the hat to Jim Karahalios, who has done drive-by Islamophobic smears of Waleed Solomon, a friend of the Mulroneys, works in the same law firm. And so you have to be careful who you play with, because really some of the right-wing stuff, which I know we'll talk about, attracts all kinds of moths.
Jim is not here to defend himself on that, but I would just simply say for the record, he denies what you just said, just for the record. Okay, Sean, your take on the principle we're talking about here.
Well, I think Mr. Black has his causality wrong. I don't think that Doug Ford has pushed the Liberals and New Democrats to the left. I think they've gone willingly. Since about 2014, we've seen a leftward shift of both the provincial Liberals in Ontario and the National Liberal Party. I think there's two reasons for that, Steve. One is ideological. I think the current generation of liberal activists see themselves as progressives and distinguish that from, say, the politics of the Chrétien years, or frankly, even the McGuinty years in some ways. But part of it is tactical. I think there is a view amongst Big L liberal strategists that a progressive politics that increasingly marginalizes the New Democrats and the party's value proposition essentially creates a kind of two-party race, and 9 times out of 10, just because of the kind of general ideological underpinnings of Canadian society, a center-left party is going to defeat a center-right party. And so I think we've seen that shift occurring on the left in Canada and in Ontario, and that has been to the benefit of Doug Ford. He's run, as Ginny has said, a pretty moderate government, one at times that has frustrated ideological conservatives like Ginny and me. But it seems to me, from a kind of crass political point of view, the benefits of that approach are self-evident in a world in which the Liberals and New Democrats have, for all intents and purposes, vacated the center of politics on spending, on a kind of hardened form of identity politics. It's certainly to the benefit of Doug Ford, and I think that'll be expressed on election day. Just one final point, Steve, maybe just to drive this point home. The fact that we have 8 unions now endorsing the Progressive Conservative Party.
Private sector unions.
Yes, in this race, I think reflects the fact that the Liberals and New Democrats have kind of lost their way on matters of economic justice, and have been kind of increasingly consumed, as progressives have elsewhere in North America, with a kind of identity politics. And it seems to me one of the outcomes of this race, assuming these polls are correct, is I think it will require progressives to kind of go through a process of introspection. Is identity politics harming the kind of fecundity and resonance of their economic agenda, which polls tell us are actually quite popular?
That's a great question and fodder for a future program. But again, I just want to clarify, the union backing of Premier Ford has really been quite an impressive accomplishment, but they're all private sector unions that whose coffers have been magnificently filled by the capital projects of the current government. There are no public sector unions that are backing the Tories. They're all backing the NDP and a couple of Green candidates. But having said that, Ginny,
to your point, Steve, just briefly, you're quite right. Also, building trades, right? So construction unions in particular, not just private sector, but specifically the building trade.
Exactly. Yeah. Ginny, I wanted to get your take on. We've talked a lot about New Blue during the course of the campaign. They've got most of the attention because the Karahalioses, they do tend to attract attention. They're an interesting couple. They had a seat in the last legislature, not elected to it, but Belinda Karahalios, when she was kicked out of the PC caucus, joined and created this New Blue Party. But I noticed on television the other day, the Ontario Party of Derek Sloan's they've got commercials out there now. And there's an Ontario First Party and a Libertarian Party that's been around for a while. And, there's still a Trillium Party that's out there, which also is a right-wing party. There are a lot of right-wing alternatives in this province right now. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about what you think is driving the emergence of all of this.
Yes, well, I think those splits are important to note, right, for political outcome purposes. I said at the beginning that I don't think there's going to be much of a political outcome that's relevant, that's driven by the growth of the New Blue, and partially that's because people on the right who want an alternative to the Ford PCs, that effort is kind of split amongst all these different small parties, and they all seem to be sort of single issue or single message parties that, frankly, the other point I'd make is it's really hard to mount a political party and increase your name recognition and get into the media and get out in front of people. New Blue is doing the best job. They have the most candidates nominated. They have a sort of semi-coherent policy platform. The others are sort of vanity projects, I think, for their leaders who are not doing a terribly good job of increasing their name recognition. And so that vote's splitting. But I think part of why they're stuck on one or two issues, particularly COVID, which a lot of people are over now and don't want to think about anymore, is because, yes, I just want to get back to this Ford positioning question. Yes, he's sort of center moderate on economic issues and material issues, where Sean's right, the left really has kind of vacated and moved further to the left and left him that room on the center. But the other piece in terms of these union endorsements and these sort of the kinds of people that are the union members, because I think, by the way, the thing that's driving these union endorsements is their membership, and the leadership's catching up to the membership, not the other way around. The leaders want to be where their members are. And the reason those members are with Ford, for the most part, is because culturally, he does have some pretty conservative touch points on crime, building on his brother's legacy of sort of the tax piece and the fees piece that Martin was talking about around stopping the gravy trade, and the Ontario public and the kinds of people who are members of these unions, they want to make sure their hospitals are built and highways are built and the province is spending on the things that they want the province to spend on. But they also want a government that's going to be tough on crime. They want a government that's going to, and a leader who kind of speaks to them and uses their language, which Ford is very good on. So it's not as simple as this left-right spectrum. And that's, I think, why you see this fracturing of these parties on the right, because there's no one a theme or there's no broad grouping of policies they can seize on that Ford has vacated on the right, because it doesn't really exist.
Let me suggest a theme here. Martin, let me get you to play with this one if you would. Belinda Carr-Halios was kicked out of the PC caucus. She started the New Blue Party. Rick Nichols was kicked out of the PC caucus for refusing to be vaccinated. He's now running for the Ontario Party. Derek Sloan was kicked out of the federal Conservative caucus. He's now the leader of the Ontario Party. How much do you think revenge is behind the creation of all of these new right-wing parties?
Well, connect the dots. It's funny that they didn't form these ideological cause or cri de coeur until they were kicked out and had nowhere else to go, had to leave the sandbox and build one all themselves. So yes, that's the motivation. Revenge or a reprise, let's say. I think you forgot that Randy Hillier, who was flirting with setting up his own party as well, until he got into so much trouble over COVID, anti-vax, convoys, anti-everything, that he kind of fell apart. So absolutely, it is about it's personal, and it is also anti-vax, and in that sense, it is anti-science. Jenny talked about how it was partly in later stages that people were wondering, well, why do we have these restrictions? But remember, these parties formed when the science was most compelling. Science changes, by the way, as new evidence comes along. But when we didn't think that COVID could be transmitted if we could get vaccinated, and that would stop transmission, that's when the vaccine passports were brought in. Until further notice, a new variant, Omicron, etc. So that's part of it. But they created their own sandboxes. But guess what? Now New Blue can't play well with others, and as often happens in any ideological, even religious atomization, fractures, different denominations. And so if you look at that New Blue's website, you'll see he's attacking the other parties personally. He goes after Randy Hillier for secret conspiracies. He goes after Derek Sloan for secret conspiracies. It's all over the map. They can't play well with others, and it's except with his own wife and the wife with husband.
Well, okay, Sean, I see you smiling, so why don't you just pick up from there?
It's like the Marxist-Leninists fighting with the communists over the over the old communist vote. If I could just make 2 points, Steve, about the conversation so far. I agree with Ginny that in large part because of the weakness of the Liberals and the New Democrats in this race, it's unlikely that the rise of these new parties on the right will have a significant impact on the election outcome. But that was not obvious from the start. You mentioned we've seen some polling that puts the New Blue Party at something like 5 points in this race province-wide. It's worth noting that there are a dozen or so ridings in that the Progressive Conservative Party won in the last election by fewer than 5 points. And so assuming that support leads to some of these other parties, it could put some races in jeopardy. On the other hand, my second point is, in a kind of counterintuitive way, there may be an argument that the proliferation of these parties is good for Doug Ford. One of the challenges that Jason Kenney had in Alberta is a lot of the people that now occupy these different parties in Ontario were part of the Alberta United Conservative Party. And so he had to deal with them in his caucus, within his membership and so on. And, it seems to me some of the very people who now are represented in these different parties in Ontario are the exact people, kind of conceptually, who ultimately sacked Jason Kenney. And so, in a way, while it may pose some local threats for progressive conservatives, I think there's a case that on balance, it probably serves the party well. It enables Doug Ford and the progressive conservatives to position party policies, including on COVID, is kind of moderate and a compromise between demands from the Liberals and the Democrats for more restrictions and demands from these new right-wing parties for fewer restrictions. It seems to me kind of one of the results we might find come Thursday is that the New Blue Party, the Ontario Party, and some of these other parties may ultimately be some of Doug Ford's best friends.
Well, that's the intriguing question. And Ginny, let me pick up on that with you, because if we go back to the last federal election, I think it was, Global News did a survey and they discovered that the People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier's party, did so well by stealing votes that the federal Conservative Party otherwise would have had the People's Party not been running, that it cost them 6 seats. Now, in the end, that didn't cost the Conservatives power, but because it wasn't that close an election in terms of the seat count. But Frank Graves now of ECOS is saying that if New Blue, here's the quote, the New Blue Party could be a critical factor in deciding whether Doug Ford achieves the majority he is seeking. Is it possible, do you think, on Thursday, that New Blue and these other right-wing entrants could take enough votes away from the Progressive Conservative Party, which would otherwise get them, to deny them the seat count they need?
So I think it's highly unlikely that Ford will not win a majority on Thursday. I think the polling shows us that he is winning so many votes in the center and on the center right that he will form probably a large majority. That's what it's looking like. So it's not a short-term political challenge for him, but I do think it's a long-term political consideration for him. And where I might differ with Sean a little bit is, I think it was a legitimate challenge for Aaron O'Toole that he let what is a huge coalition of right-of-center voters in Canada kind of split. Right, he sent a lot of voters to the PPC because he was so fixated on moderating himself for votes in the center that ultimately he didn't win enough of to balance out what he lost on the right. You saw something similar in intra-party dynamics for Jason Kenney and the UCP in Alberta. And that is a risk for any right of center leader who's trying to hold together a broad coalition in basically any province in Canada, maybe with the exception of the Atlantic provinces. If Ford wins a majority government, that helps. It gives him a lot of breathing room, but he's going to have to face at some point a policy convention with his party members who will feel a bit more open, I think, to challenging him if they feel like they don't get what they need from him. And he doesn't have a set of policies and priorities, some of which appeal to those voters on the right. I'll bring up, for instance, education policy. I think partly driven by COVID, people in Ontario have been very, very frustrated by education policy, and Conservatives haven't had a lot to say about it. The left does, and we know what their view is. But there are all sorts of innovative, interesting, right of center takes on bringing marketplace economics to education in a way that drives better quality outcomes for students. And you don't hear a peep about that from the Ontario PCs. In those big areas of concern, if Conservatives just keep vacating those policy areas, eventually voters will start to look for an alternative. So that's something I think they have to be aware of, and I think they will be. And they'll with a majority government, hopefully they'll have the room to explore some of those policy areas, and hopefully people like Sean will drive some of that policy thinking. And I think that's also why you see at the federal level in the Conservative leadership race, you see candidates really trying to bring back together that broad coalition and appeal to all different kinds of Conservatives and right of center voters by talking about fundamental freedoms and some of the sort of baseline expectations that Conservative voters have for their leaders.
Martin, you and I
Steve,
are old enough to. Yeah, sorry, you wanted to pick
go
up
ahead,
on...
Steve. Go ahead.
Okay,
I
well,
was going to jump in if I could.
Yeah.
Just sorry, we're talking over each other a little bit because of the lags in technology. But just to pick up on your question about, I was surprised when I read that comment from Frank, because not just because it does seem as if the ceiling will almost guarantee or certainly likely be a Conservative majority, but this was a consideration many months ago when the thought, the expectation was that the right-wing parties wouldn't actually win a single seat, but that they could deprive the Tories of a couple of close ridings, narrow margins of victory the last time, oddly enough, even in Toronto. So, for example, King of Surma in Etobicoke might have beaten some peril. I think a lot of pollsters, the consensus is that not only will the right not win a single seat, but they won't deprive the Tories of a single seat. That doesn't mean it couldn't have happened and it couldn't have been a close call if there had been other breaks. So that's one thought. Just to Jenny's point, though, I also think while Aaron O'Toole had his hands full dealing with these kinds of splinterings and pushback, Ontario is not Canada, so that the analogies can't be drawn too closely. But there's another important point. Ontario, the most powerful Conservative leader in Canada for many years, has not been Jason Kenney or Aaron O'Toole or Andrew Scheer. It won't be Pierre Poilievre. It's Doug Ford, because he has power in Canada's second biggest government. And with power comes the ability to discipline, to expel, to demand compliance, because not just because you're scaring people, but because these backbenchers don't want to lose their perch in caucus, their salary supplements as PAs or deputy speakers and so on. So I think that's part of it. And just one final quick thing to Jenny about education. Actually, the Conservatives flirted with some reforms. They tried to impose mandatory online learning, and there was a lot of pushback to that. Other parties have experimented with educational reform. The Green Party, another outlying party, not out there, but outlying in terms of being at about 5% support. They were talking for years about removing the separate school system, religious funding for Catholic schools. They don't talk about that anymore. So there is some convergence on education because it's not selling right now.
That's still technically part of their platform. I did confirm that earlier in this campaign, for the Green Party, that is, putting the school system under unified governance. But they're not campaigning on it because they say the school system's been through enough and they don't want to put it through any more hecticness. I'm sure that's not a word, but it's the first thing that came to mind. No, listen, Sean, I want to try this one more time with you, because I think this is a real thing, only because we've seen it before. And I'm old enough to remember back in 1990, there was a party called the Family Coalition Party, and there was another Northern Ontario grievance party called the Confederation of Regions Party, both of whom combined to earn 200,000 votes. And those votes came from both Liberal and Conservative candidates and helped create the perfect storm of odd vote splits that allowed the NDP to win a majority government in that election. Now, it hasn't happened again since, but again, when you see all of the attention that these new right-wing parties are getting, I think it's a reasonable question to ask, could that phenomenon happen again on Thursday? What do you think?
I think the short answer on Thursday is no, but I take the broader point, Steve. You gave a historical analogy. Let me give you one. We're speaking today on almost the 26th anniversary of the Winds of Change conference in Calgary that was hosted by David Frum and others to try to start the process of uniting the right at the federal level. We know the consequences of this kind of fragmentation in Conservative politics. We've lived with it for the better part of 15 or 20 years at the national level. So I think it does represent a real risk. I think the question before Conservative leaders in Ontario and nationally is how they can incorporate some of these voices and ideas that are represented in the New Blue Party and the Ontario Party and others, without alienating or turning off swing voters across the country that are ultimately crucial for Conservatives to win national and provincial elections. Ginny, as you mentioned, is involved in Pierre Poilievre's leadership race. Mr. Poilievre clearly has a kind of vision and strategy to bring some of the voters that were lost in the 2021 federal election back into the Conservative fold. And the question for him between now and should he become leader is he able to do that? Is he able to kind of walk the line of advancing ideas and messages that appeal to those voters without turning off other voters? And as we've been talking today, Doug Ford, for a host of, I think, contingent and particularistic reasons here in the province of Ontario, has had an easier path to walk than a series of Conservative leaders have nationally. So I guess that's a long way of saying, Steve, even though I think what you're hearing from us is that this probably won't be a major issue this week, it is most definitely an issue that has dogged Conservatives in the past and will continue to dog them in the future. And the kind of politics around the pandemic has only made that job more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ginny, that prompts a sort of, fancy pants view from 30,000 feet kind of question that I want to ask you right now, which is really what it means to be a Conservative in Ontario at this moment in our history. I mean, this progressive Conservative Ontario government has done some very unconservative things. If you compare it, for example, to the last Conservative government of Mike Harris. This is a premier who's done press conferences with union leaders. This is a leader who's done a lot of pro-labor policy. He's raised the minimum wage. This is a leader that's done a bunch of things that I think a lot of Conservatives are shaking their heads at. So what does it mean to be a Conservative right now in Ontario?
Well, Steve, the world's also changed, right? And when you talk about that labor policy, the life of a worker and the job that they're in today is nothing like the life of a worker under the Mike Harris government. And so, kudos to Minister Bonnie McNaughton, the Minister of Labor, and the Premier for trying to lead on those issues. Conservatives so often get our lunch eaten on innovative policies that address the problems of today for people. And the Premier and Bonnie McNaughton have not let that happen. They've led on that, and actually Sean sat on a panel, I think, at the minister's request to advise them on some of those innovative policies. So that's great. And don't forget on economics, there's no question that this is a big spending government. And right now, I don't think there's a lot of appetite to cut back on that. But Martin, I'll bring it up again. On fees and taxes, the issue that everyone's fixated on right now when it comes to the economy is not, there are lots of jobs. It's not growth. It's affordability. People can barely get gas in their tanks. And, if you want to talk about affordability, Ford was mocked for running against the carbon tax, but I think in large part he won because of his position on the carbon tax. And he's totally kneecapped the ability of the NDP or the Liberal leadership to talk about the price of gas, because everyone knows that they wanted to increase it by design. That was the design of the carbon tax, was to increase the price of gas. And now when people can't afford it, that's the last thing they want to hear. And that sounds pretty conservative to me. For the PCs to be able to run on that record, that's pretty powerful.
Well, okay, but on the other hand, Martin, we see so many different incarnations of what it means to be a Conservative Party these days that I wonder whether or not the days of sort of everybody reasonably happily coexisting under one big blue tent are over. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think, remember, Randy Hillier was kind of welcomed into the Progressive Conservative Party by none other than John Tory when he was leader of the Ontario PCs. The idea of the big blue tent brought Randy Hillier within until he became bring your enemies close within. But at a certain point, it became too much to handle. And Randy Hillier, too, was expelled from the Progressive Conservative Party and just went to a different place. And so Jason Kenney tried that. Of course, he had a different imperative. It wasn't just pulling in the Ontario landowners, which is Randy Hillier's old home. It was trying to block out the NDP by uniting two parties. So bringing in the tent and trying to bring them all within is a seductive strategy or tactic. But it can blow up, and that's what happened. That's what Doug Ford did. He said, you know what, this isn't working. This is actually fragmenting, and I'm losing discipline. A lesson that Jason Kenney learned at the cost of his leadership too late, because he didn't crack down, and perhaps he couldn't. I mean, they're different parties, different provinces, different personalities. I mean, Jenny talking about the unions. Part of it also is that Doug Ford can cast himself as the everyman and break down or surmount some of these ideological barriers. And also, Doug Ford stopped beating up the unions, by which I mean he stopped calling these elected labor leaders union bosses and spitting out the word. And Monty McNaughton stopped spitting out the word too. They reformed. They now hold joint photo ops with them. So part of it is just playing nice, and that gets you far in politics.
Sean, in our last minute here, maybe I can get you to weigh in on, some of these parties come and go. Others, like the Greens, are still around 35 years later and are finally electing MPPs now. Of all of the new right-wing entrants on the Ontario political scene, who's here for good, do you think?
It's a great question, Steve. I think the outstanding question, not just for these new right-wing parties in Ontario, but even the People's Party of Canada, is whether this is merely a pandemic-induced political development or if it has longer legs. You mentioned that the People's Party did something like 5% nationally in the last election. That jumped from about 1% when Maxime Bernier tried to run against immigration. It was when he found the political magic of anti-pandemic restrictions that his numbers went up. So I guess that's a long way of saying, Steve, unless some of these Ontario parties can find a successor issue to pandemic restrictions, my gut is that long-term those voters will ultimately come home. And I think the same probably will apply nationally, especially if Pierre Poilievre's elected, because he talks to some of these voters in a kind of form of muscle memory, whereas some of the other leadership candidates may have a harder time bringing some of those voters home because it's less of a kind of intramural conversation. So I guess that's a long way of saying I don't see these parties being with us for good.
Normally, I thank the guests from left to right on this program, but for this one, it feels appropriate to do it from right to left. So let me thank Sean Speer, who's in New York, Jenny Roth in Toronto, Martin Redcon in Midtown. Thanks for being on the agenda tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.